Hi, you just typed in, what is the exposure triangle? My name's Ivan Eyre, although most of my friends know me as Ozzy, and a few years ago I started a home business to allow myself more time to spend on things such as my hobby, which is photography. Now, the exposure triangle, as you'd expect, has three elements. They are ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. We're going to take a quick look at all three of those, but we'll probably cover them individually in more detail in separate videos. Okay, so when we're taking a photograph, what we're looking for is to get as close to the ideal exposure as possible, as close to the best image we can get. We'll never get perfection though, because it's always a compromise with photography. So let's start with ISO, which is probably sometimes the most difficult of these to grasp. Now, ISO relates to the sensitivity, the light sensitivity of, in the case of a sort of a modern day, modern day camera such as a DSLR or a compact digital camera. It's the light sensitivity of the sensor inside the camera. And it also, it predates that. Digital photography inherited it from these sorts of things, which are old style film cameras, some of which are almost as old as me, where we had different light sensitivity of film. Now, the ISO rating is simply a number, and the larger the number, the more sensitive either the sensor or the film is to light. So an ISO of 100 is typically the sort of base rating for a digital camera. And you can get ISO settings of 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400, and they normally go up by multiples of 2. We won't go into. There are other reasons for having intermediate ratings, but we won't go into those at the moment. So, the more sensitive the sensor or the film is to light, the less light you need going in here into the lens of the camera and hitting the sensor or the film to create the ideal image. There is, though, a trade-off. Essentially, the higher the ISO rating, in a digital camera, you will be more susceptible to what's called noise. And I don't know if you've ever noticed if you've taken a photograph in in the dark and you've had the ISO setting up, there's sort of a mottled appearance to it. Sort of colours that aren't really there, particularly in the shadows. And in a film camera such as this, you'll get what's called grain. I actually quite like grain, and I'll use high ISO films deliberately for the effect that gives. But that's the trade-off. For a grainless or a noiseless image, you want to use as low an ISO setting or on a digital camera or lowest ISO film rating on a film camera as you can. So that's one of those corners of the triangle, the ISO. So that governs the sensitivity to light. Now the other two elements are, as I've said, the shutter speed and the aperture. Let's have a look at aperture for a moment, and for that I'm going to take off this from this camera here, if I can, this old lens, and I'm going to show you what the aperture is. Now, I don't know if you're going to be able to see this. I hope you're going to be able to pick this up, but can you see as I turn this ring on the outside, the opening in the lens, that's called the aperture, opens and closes. Okay, so if I'm in a sort of low light situation, I want lots of light to go in, I'll have it open. If it's a bright day, I'll close it up. Now it's not quite as simple as that, and there are other reasons for doing that, but we'll cover that as I say, in a later video. But essentially, that's controlling the amount of light that is entering to hit the sensor or the film at the back. Now, the aperture is measured, or it's not strictly measured, it's graded in f-stops. You probably heard that in photography, f-stops. Now, it's a little bit counterintuitive, but the f-stops are given numbers, so typically speaking, you'll find f2. This lens happens to be f1.7, and there are wider opening lenses. But typically speaking, they'll start at f2, maybe even higher numbers than that. But the higher the number, the narrower the aperture. Now it's counterintuitive. So the lower the number, the more light you're letting in. And the higher the number, the more closed up that. It's called an iris in there, very like the iris in your eye. Opens and closes. So the higher the number, the more tightly closed it is, and the lower the number, the more open it is. So that controls the amount of light that's flowing through there. Now, the other way you can control the light is in essentially the amount of time the shutter is open for. And I'm going to see if I can... This is quite an old, stiff camera. This is a very old camera. And if you'll bear with me a second, it's not always the most well-behaved. Let's see if we can get the lens off of this one. I think that moved a bit there. Right. Apologies for that. It's a bit of a hobby of mine collecting these old cameras. And you can usually get them for not much money at all. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to flip open the back to start with. And I'm going to show you... I don't know if it's the camera's picking this up, but here there's a cloth screen. And that is actually the shutter. And I'm going to wind it on and I'm going to fire it. So you can probably... Did you see that? Probably a little bit quick. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the shutter speed to a very slow speed. Here we are. We'll go down to... Should have put my specs on for this, shouldn't I? We'll go down to a full 1 second opening. And you'll see... There you go. Did you see that? So that's the shutter. Now in an SLR or a digital SLR, you'll have a mirror in front of the shutter, and I'll explain that in another video as well. But essentially, we're changing the amount. We can change by changing the shutter speed. There's a dial on top here, and we can change the shutter speed. And this particular camera, it goes from 1 second all the way to 1,000th of a second. Now, this is an old camera, and in its day, that was quite, quite a fast shutter speed, the 1,000th of a second. I'll just show you the 1,000th of a second. I don't know if the camera will pick that up. Much, much quicker, of course. Now, essentially what we're doing there is we're regulating the amount of light that is going through by either increasing or reducing the amount of time. Now, hope you've gathered from that then, we've got these three things. We've got the sensitivity of the medium on which the light is falling, either a sensor or film, so it's sensitivity to light. And we've got how much light, if you like, the bore of the pipe that we're letting the light in through, with the opening and closing of that iris, the f-stops. And we've got the amount of time for which it's open, from the light can actually pass through that hole into the sensor or the film at the back there. Now, as you can imagine, it's a case of achieving an equilibrium in all of that, getting as close as you possibly can to the ideal exposure. Now, in a modern camera, if you're not shooting on fully automatic, I would urge you not to shoot on fully automatic. There's hardly such a thing as a bad camera these days. Explore its capabilities, and you do that best by switching off the automatic. But typically speaking, in a modern day camera, you will set two things, and the camera itself will work out the third. So you will typically set the ISO setting. You'll choose the ISO setting through the menu and set that electronically. And then you'll set either the aperture or the shutter speed. And knowing those two bits of information, the camera can work out for itself what the third should be to get as close to the ideal exposure as possible. Now, here's something to bear in mind. Your camera will actually give you several correct exposures. Now that may seem strange, but think about it for a moment. We're talking about an equilibrium here. If we set an ISO setting of, say, f100, and we set our aperture to, let's say, f4, and the camera works out that we need 1/500th of a second to give us shutter speed to give us the correct exposure. So that's 1/500th of a second at f4. Now, if we then decided we wanted to open our shutter up one full stop, which takes it to actually f2.8, that makes it twice as wide. That's actually moving it. Each stop is a factor, is a doubling or a halving. So we open it up to f2.8, so we can actually increase the speed of our shutter to 1/1000th of a second. So the amount of light is exactly the same. f4, 500th of a second, f2.8, 1/1000th of a second. Conversely, if we decided to close the shutter down, close the aperture down to f5.6, which is half the aperture of f4, then we would need to double the length of time the shutter stayed open. So we'd move that to 1/200th and 250th of a second. Now, there are reasons for choosing either a fast shutter speed or a wide or narrow aperture that will affect the eventual look of the image. But each of them will be correctly exposed. Now, in a future video, we may well go into that in more depth. But I hope that makes sense. So you've got this triangle. Remember, there are only 3 things to learn. There's ISO, there's shutter speed, and there's aperture. Once you've got the hang of them, they're never going to change. They haven't changed in all the 100+ years of photography, and they're never going to change in the future. Once you've actually got those nailed on, you're good to go. And once you understand them, your photography will improve beyond measure. Now, as I said, some time ago, I started a home business to allow me to spend more time with my cameras. Now, if you'd like to learn more about that home business, there'll be a button or a link below here. It might be a big blue button, or it might just be a text link below this video. Click on that and you'll find out more about what I do. And I hope to see you again very soon. Cheers then. Bye-bye.